Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger with the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for April 14th, 2021. This morning we're going to take a look at the deadly hypocrisy coming from Washington, London, and Brussels in relationship to the strategic crises that are unfolding with Ukraine and the deadly crisis that's being imposed on Syria. Let's start with the one semi-positive development, which was as the danger is deepening of a U.S.-Russian confrontation over Ukraine, there was a call made yesterday by President Biden to Russia's President Putin, in which he proposed, among other things, a summit between the two in the coming months in a third country. The readout from the White House said that they would pursue a dialogue on a, quote, range of arms control and emerging security issues, unquote. Now, Biden, still in his discussion, told Putin that the U.S. is unhappy with Russian policy. He had told Putin the U.S. has an unwavering commitment to the security of Ukraine and called on Russia to de-escalate. Now, for those who know something about the crisis, the actual escalation began late March when President Zelensky of Ukraine put out a decree proclaiming that Crimea is a permanent part of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian forces were massing along the border of the breakaway republics in the Donbass. The Russians responded by sending troops to the Ukrainian border on the Russian side, and when the Ukrainians said, "Why are you doing that?" the Russians said, "This is our country." But the confrontation of words has continued, with Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials demanding an entrance into NATO in order to deter what they're saying would be Russian aggression. Pushing this forward was Secretary of State Blinken in Brussels yesterday, meeting with NATO officials, EU officials, and also Foreign Minister Kuleba of Ukraine was there, talking about the importance of NATO backup for Ukraine to deter Russia, and more importantly, insisting that Ukraine be brought into NATO. If Ukraine were to join NATO, this would be a tripwire. The Russians have said repeatedly this is a red line. They will not allow NATO troops to be on the border of Russia. At the same time, it was announced that 2 U.S. warships entered the Black Sea, which was denounced by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, who said it was a provocation designed to test Russia's nerves. You also had the strange event of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announcing that the United States will add 500 troops to the NATO deployment in Germany. This is in reaction to President Trump's call at the end of last year for the U.S. to pull out of Germany. Now, there's also a discussion of placement of U.S. missiles inside Ukraine. Now, this is mostly coming from Ukrainians, but it is being taken seriously by NATO. If you put offensive weapons or so-called lethal weapons in Ukraine that would be aimed at Russia, this would be going again over another red line. So the Russians responded to President Biden's statement, his offer, with a cautious response. But one spokesman said they're pleased it would take place in a third country, as opposed to in Washington, where you would be in the midst of a bipartisan assemblage of crazed war hawks in the Congress, in the think tanks, and in the media. So we'll see what happens with that. But it's a very dangerous moment now. And it's really crucial to understand that this is part of an ongoing provocation aimed at regime change against Russia, which includes sanctions over the Navalny affair. It includes an attempt to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia into Western Europe. And it also just continues the warnings from the West to Russia to not expand their influence in Southwest Asia. Now, coming to Southwest Asia, Helga Zepp LaRouche, the chairman of the Schiller Institute, has issued a call for a mobilization to stop the sanctions that are being carried out against the Syrian people as part of an overall mobilization of an anti-Malthusian front against the effects of hunger, the pandemic, and wars. This is an important push coming from Mrs. LaRouche and will be the focus of an upcoming conference on May 8th. Now, in specific, she's focused on the situation in Syria right now, where UN officials admit that 90% of the population of Syria is now living below the poverty level. And this has been increased recently because of the so-called Caesar sanctions, which were imposed by Secretary of State Pompeo, but have the continuing support of Biden's Secretary of State Blinken. This was an act that passed in June of 2020, which was a reaction to the Human Rights Watch release of a report which was based on photos allegedly compiled by a Syrian defector who took photos in Syrian detention camps and hospitals. The report issued by Human Rights Watch, which was an 89-page report, has more than 28,000 photos of dead and mutilated bodies included in the dossier. The Human Rights Watch claims that they did work to, quote, they were involved in meticulously verifying dozens of stories of people whose pictures could be identified. That's dozens, somewhere around 30, out of 28,000 photos that were of Syrian civilians who allegedly were victims of the Assad government. Now, they admitted in this report that many of the photos were of Syrian soldiers who were killed in the civil war, meaning by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra affiliates, which were armed and trained by U.S. Special Forces and the U.S. military. That also included victims of bombings, of assassinations, car bombs, and just general warfare, which was not necessarily the doing of the Syrian government, because the Syrian government was defending its sovereignty against terrorists who were supported by NATO and the United States. Now, on the sanctions itself, it's worth looking at the comments of the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, who exposes the complete hypocrisy of the U.S. position. When the act was initially passed and implemented in June 2020, he said, "We're not demanding total victory. We're not saying that Assad has to go." But he said the goal of the act is to make it clear to anyone who wants to rebuild Assad's Syria that that cannot happen without Caesar sanctions. In other words, any country that does business with Syria now will be a target of sanctions, as he admitted. And he said this will continue until there's a government in Damascus that carries out U.S. demands with what he described as real eagerness. And he said again, and he reiterated, that anyone engaged in economic activity in Syria will be a, quote, potential sanctions target. This means food is not getting through. This means medical supplies and medical parts are not getting through. Fuel, machine parts for the industry. It's putting Syria into the vice grip of a total genocidal strangulation. Now, here's something that you should consider in looking at this. While this bill passed almost unanimously in Congress and was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, there was scarcely a voice raised against it to bring up the question of what about the victims of U.S. torture and U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq? What about the civilian toll of the war on terror? What about the millions whose lives are endangered by these sanctions? Are these not crimes against humanity? Does this not threaten the so-called rules-based order that the U.S. claims to be enforcing by imposing these sanctions on the Syrian people? What about the treatment of the person who exposed the war crimes of the United States, Julian Assange, who in WikiLeaks published documents from U.S. military and security forces verifying U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq? Instead of treating that as criminal activity to be sanctioned, Assange has been rotting away in a London prison, awaiting extradition to the United States for a trial which will probably take his life. So the question is raised here, who's committing human rights violations? The And why are human rights violations on behalf of the United States and the Allies tolerated in order to supposedly bring about justice for the victims in Syria? Now, it's this hypocrisy that has to be challenged. The Schiller Institute, as I said, will be holding a conference on May 8th in which this, as well as the treatment of the people of Yemen, who are also facing starvation due to sanctions and war, will be the main subject. Go to our website, the LaRouche Organization, and to the schillerinstitute.com website for more details on this. So that's my report for today, and I'll see you again tomorrow.